Mixing with Mike mixing tip, creating depth in a mix with early reflections. When I talk about early reflections, and you hear me mention this a lot, if you follow some of my mixing tips and tips on reverbs and using things like that, early reflections are the first reflections that come back from the spaces. So in terms of what happens with reverb, there are three aspects to reverb. There's the direct sound, there is early reflections, and then there is reverberation. Now, when you think direct sound, you think the dry signal, and that's not actually true. Because imagine that you had a guitar amp or somebody singing on the other side of the room, and you are the microphone or you are the person listening on the other side of the room. When that person sings, the direct sound is the signal, that the waveform that hits you first, right? That comes directly from the person singing, talking, guitar amp playing, or whatever, that hits you directly. But in addition to that, it doesn't go straight at you and no place else. Sound goes in all directions at different frequency responses, and it bounces off walls. And when it bounces off the floor, it will hit you a slight delay time later, colored by the way it bounced off the floor and what got absorbed and what came back up toward you. Same with the side walls, ceiling, wall behind you, and then also some off angles where it kind of, hits the floor, hits a corner, and then bounces back. And all of these reflections that come, they kind of define spaces that are created. Now, the use of early reflections is can be as simple as a single mono slap, which creates depth. So when people think about like tape slaps and things like that, the power of the tape slap was something simple. It's just a delay. So if you imagine yourself, you walk down an alleyway or you walk near a building that, in a parking lot, you have this big brick building or something, or concrete building out in front of you, slap your hands and you hear a delay of that slapback coming back to you. And it gives you a sense of distance of how far away you are from something. And it's a binaural cue that your brain is very familiar with. So you're not receiving cues from sides and behind you and all that, just a single one, maybe coming right back directly from that building. And that can be stereo too. So maybe you're going down an alleyway and you're getting those reflections from a couple of side walls. Or multiple buildings, however you want to do it. But the point here is that it can be as simple as like a single reflection, multiple reflections, or a maze of reflections, a number of them. And what happens is they will create or define a space. Now, one of the powers of working with early reflections, so I'll kind of define them into three basic levels, because the direct signal, for the most part, you negate. In reverb. There are some reverbs like the true verb actually allows you to put in the direct position, and that actually plays a role in the way and the timing of some of the other things like the early reflections, which is kind of cool. But you have the direct sound, so we're negating that. Early reflections, and the reverberant energy is the continuation of those reflections, and they accumulate and become dense, and then they actually form their own separate thing. So early reflections are actually more felt than heard, because what happens is that they typically happen in most spaces that we're in a very short period of time. And if they happen to occur in a timing that is more or less than 20 milliseconds, so that's a rough area, it's a gray area, not like a hard number, then it will sort of merge with the original, but it will provide binaural information or cueing that will give us the sense that something is in a space. And when working in a mix, it's a very important component and a very powerful way of actually getting your mix to kind of open up. Now, what happens is in the sizing up of something, so for example here, what I'm going to have is I'm going to take some drums here, I'm going to kill some of the extra reverb and squash and all of that sort of stuff. And so what I want you to do is listen to this. So what I have here, and I'm just going to make a copy of it just so you could hear it. So I have a drum performance. I'll kill the bass here for a second. And this is with and without it. So you can hear the fluttering of the different echoes as it kind of goes through. So what I want to show you here is what happens when I take down the size. So I can make this drum, and these are all sampled drums, it's all programmed as you can hear. Could appear in a very small space. And I'm going to exaggerate it. And it gets to a point, obviously, where those reflections are too heavy. But what I can do is I can define a space that gives a feeling of, or the sensation of it being in a three-dimensional environment. I could also set variations. And then I can add EQs along with that. So I can vary this so that I can add brightness. Because this is so long, that's not going to work. Or I could add low end energy. Right? So if I want to add some body to the kick, or I could roll it off. Alright, so I'll stay with variation 0, which seems to be the most balanced. Now, I'm never going to mix it in this much. In fact, you kind of have to listen for a little bit and then kind of blend it in, just so you feel it. So that's at a place I'm exaggerating a little bit more so that I can hear it. Now what I have here is, because you've probably seen, is like a compressor here. This is compressing with the kick and the snare feeding in the tom, so it's triggering this to pump and breathe, which helps to exaggerate the effect of it. Now that simple thing sets the stage for the next layer. So if I go back to what the original setting was that I had here, and you notice that size, I can now make the reverb that size, and now I can put almost any type of reverb that I want in here, and it will help to fill out that space and create that character that I'm looking for. And that little flutteriness you don't really hear because it's down enough in level. And now, on a different level, another way to kind of look at this is to work with, for example, with guitars. So if I now go over here to a pair of guitars, what I found with guitars is that in general, if you start working with early reflections, the simpler the better. So here, this is just a simple stereo tape slap. And the delay times here are quite short. They're like 12 milliseconds. Sometimes I'll offset them, but because they're panned hard left and right, and the sends feeding into them are also following that same panning, then the delay actually occurs on the same side. And it creates a sense of depth. So I can change the timing on this in the same way that I change the length, and it will add depth to the guitar without making it fuzzy. See, especially heavy distorted guitars, what ends up happening is they're so complex that all those extra reflections add to the complexity, and it can smear the stereo field. Whereas essentially what the early reflections in the drums become is sort of like a very diffusive, or I'm sorry, very undense, very open a room with not a ton of dense reflections in it. That's what the early reflections here. So with the guitar, it's better a little bit drier and more focused, and then you still get the effect. So what we can do here is get a sense of distance with this. Gotta unmute the... Now I could take these guys here and I could set a different size here. Sometimes it's worth offsetting them a little bit, making them a little different so it's not so linear. I kind of like that better than what I had before. So now I can mix this in. And it gives it a sense of like space, because it's hard to put reverb on something so dense like this. Another cool way of working with this is actually to take the panning here So we'll see for the output, and I have it reversed so I could put the delays on the opposite side. And sometimes that creates a, like, especially for double guitars like this, it can create this sort of spread width kind of room type of thing, you know, where the delay comes from the opposite end. So we can hear that in the mix. So this will be spread a little bit wider, but not as deep. So if I hear now these two guys with and without, here I'll even take the room out here too. Right, so I could do the same thing here with the vocal. What I did with the vocal here is I could do a doubler. This is actually a quadrupler, and I have a set of delays, one more distant, one closer, but this has a little detune in them. So the pitch is shifted plus minus a little bit. In this case, no modulation. So in the doubler type of effect, what I'm doing is I'm kind of layering in some depth, sort of similar to the guitars, but instead of the guitars being pan hard left and right, the vocal is here, and the timing of the delays being offset slightly on the left and right is important, because that variation or that differential here between these numbers becomes critical to hearing the stereo perception of them. So I kind of want to nudge these guys maybe a little bit farther away from each other. And so what we'll have is 4 delays at timings of around 20 and around 40 milliseconds. And again, signal flow.
Every time I see it, I wonder where you are. The things that made me laugh, now they make me cry.
Now in the context of the mix,
I miss the way I felt looking in your eyes. So I'll keep looking around with my eyes on the ground, trying to find the confidence I know I dropped. I keep retracing my steps, going through the events, trying to find out when the love stops.
so here's the even cooler part.
Just like in a set.
Is that when you start to play with this, if you feel like an instrument is a little bit dull, if you bring out some of that brightness in the early reflections, it will allow you to preserve the natural warmth of the instrument, yet give it this feeling like it's brighter without having the frequency content be brighter. It's like, and that is really the key. So when you're staging these things, and you're working with those different levels of early reflections, you create this depth space. So let's just listen to these basic, just these basic simple effects, right? This is just the early reflection.
Do
and
you
little
know
verb.
how many people own your car? Every time I
Notice the
see
front back
it,
depth.
I wonder where you are. The things that made me laugh, now they make me cry. I miss the way I felt looking in your eyes. So I'll keep looking around with my eyes on the ground, trying to find the confidence I know I dropped. I keep retracing my steps, going through the events, trying to find out when the love stopped. And just like in Assassin.
Other effects that kind of work in this similar way are like stereo chorus effects, have like that same type of thing. They add like a subtle depth and presence or width in that case. That kind of spreads things wider, whereas the early reflections have a sense of adding depth or length to something. But that's like it's if you can understand that, or you can grasp that concept, once you kind of work through the basic sounds, and you want to get that next level of separation. So you've done what you can with the EQ, and then working with some of the other tips, like if you followed the previous tip, which is about managing transients, and you start the stage, this is the next step in that. So you set that staging with the attack times to determine like the front back positioning. Now when you work with this, that helps to enhance that next layer of depth and separation, and now you start to feel that. And again, the compression of that, particularly if you can key it with the dry track, helps to make it breathe with the original signal, especially on the early reflections. That's very, very, very powerful way to kind of make that. Because the guitars are so sustaining and thick, it's not going to give you a ton here, probably on that tape slap. But that's the basic idea. So I could add presence and brightness to the guitars just by adding brightness to the early reflection, and I'll get that without getting the annoying aspect of putting the edge directly into the dry sound. And this is what makes the mix so much easier and so much more powerful, so your mixes aren't hurtful when you get there. And same thing with the warmth and depth, like the kick drum depth comes through in size in terms of the way that it projects into that room. That's what creates the size of the kick drum, not the amount of low frequency content of the dry signal. And when you start to understand that and play with that, it completely will transform the way that you mix, or it should. So anyway, here's a Mixing with Mike mixing tip, giving away all my best secrets for you for free. This is creating depth in a mix with early reflections.